Joining us today at the Vibe 105 studios is Floyd Kane, creator, showrunner, executive producer of the popular CBC series Diggstown. Diggstown is the first ever Canadian series to feature a Black Canadian woman as its lead character. It's also the longest running show produced by Black producers. How are you doing, Floyd?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Amazing. It's wonderful to have you once again. So previously, we featured Diggstown when it premiered its first season.
Right.
And today we're here discussing the final season, the season finale, the series finale of Diggstown. Just for our audiences here, what is season 4 of Diggstown all about?
The focus of season 4 was really, we wanted to create a story that's focused on migrant workers and the abuses that can befall migrant workers when they're working on farms across Canada. So what we did this season, we created an umbrella story that tells a story about this migrant worker who comes to Marcy looking for help, and then he ends up going missing. And the rest of the season is really about Marcy trying to bring to justice the people responsible for this migrant worker's disappearance.
You've very successfully included a deaf character in this particular season.
Yeah.
What was the reason behind this decision, and what were the behind the scenes of shooting that particular storyline like?
Yeah, I mean, I've wanted to have a deaf character in the show since season 2, and just whether it was production costs and time, or if it was, COVID, we were always foiled. And so going into this season, it just was really important for me to kind of make sure that I had a character in the show who was deaf, but also who was someone who I also want, like, for me, it wasn't just about, oh, let's have a deaf character. I wanted to create somebody who was flesh and blood, who was flawed, who is not necessarily the best father, but somebody who also loves their children and who is the patriarch of this very, interesting and diverse family.
As mentioned, Diggstown has stamped its legacy across Canadian broadcast, and with the series just wrapping up, what conversations does Diggstown leave open as opportunities for perhaps spin-off characters or like-minded narratives?
I think that there's always lots of possibilities when you have a show that has the sweep of characters that are on a show like Diggstown. One of the things that I would say is that in terms of spin-offs and because it's a legal show, the world never stops, right? Like, Marcy doesn't go away. We're not making a show where there's a big mystery at the end that has to be revealed. It's simply, life goes on. So we could always see those characters again.
Is there anything in the pipeline?
I'm working on something that's not a direct spin-off of Diggstown, but that's sort of Diggstown adjacent. But stay tuned.
Well, we sure will. You made your directorial debut with this particular season, which is season 4 of Diggstown. What were the intentions while taking on this particular role, and how did they evolve as you continued in your journey?
The idea was always to direct the last episode of the show. I'm not a director. I'm not necessarily interested in having a career as a director. I am a writer first. I love writing. I don't take any joy in standing in front of a large group of people and telling them what to do. That's not what I'm interested in. I like to sit in the dark and edit the pictures with the editor. So in terms of the journey, it was, let's do this. I said to the crew, I'm like, look, I can tell you what I want. I can't tell you how to do it, but I can tell you what I want, right? And the same with the actors. I can tell them what I need from them, but I'm not gonna tell them how to do it, right? So when I started going through that journey with the direction, it was a great process. Like, I was nervous at first, like extremely nervous, but at the same time, like, once I got into it, I really enjoyed the process. During the last couple days of shooting the show, I was diagnosed with COVID. So that was a really crazy period because I was on the floor directing the actors and then found out midday that I had tested positive for COVID. So we had to figure out how I could continue directing while dealing with the illness and also keeping my distance and being masked, you know, in terms of the cast and crew, keeping them safe. I mean, this was going to be our last season, and so on the last day of shoot, you know, it was already very emotional because we just happened to be shooting on location in my best friend's home, and Vinessa was there. And typically when we shoot on the last day of Diggstown, it's typically Vinessa by herself, and we're at Martinique Beach doing surfing with her double. And this year we had the entire Diggs family were on set. Vinessa was on set, and so by the time we ended up wrapping her midday, and it was a very emotional moment. Like that was tough.
You have also written the screenplay for the 2015 Canadian drama film directed by Director X, which is Across the Line.
Yeah.
How different was it curating the Diggstown experience for a network television series versus a feature film?
Feature film is different because on a feature film, the writer has to step back and let the director make the script their own. On a television series, the writer is king or queen, and you have final say over cast, director, the cuts, you know, essentially everything that you see in the box in the monitor. There was somebody like a writer who signed off on that. So that's the difference. It's like you are in way more control of the vision at the end of the day.
You went to law school in Halifax. You shot season 4 of Diggstown in Halifax. What is it about the city that keeps drawing you back?
That's home, right? It's like I get to go and visit my mom and my brothers and, you know, my several aunts and uncles. But also I think Halifax is just a place that, you know, it has a really unique makeup in terms of, you know, when in comparison to the rest of Canada. Like it's changed and it's changing, but I would not say Halifax is multicultural. I would say that Halifax has like probably 4 long-standing groups of people of color, and that would be its multi-generational Black community, a Middle Eastern community, South Asian community, and an Indigenous community. Like that, those would be the 4. Like it is not as racially or culturally diverse as Toronto or Quebec, right? For that matter, or Vancouver. I just feel like it has a very particular racial makeup, and also it has this sort of like really interesting, and maybe it's because it's a port city, but there's something about the people are very straight up, right? They're very matter of fact. I feel like you know who you're dealing with, right? And there's something very lovely about that, because I find people in Toronto are very polite and whatnot, but when you're in Halifax, people are warm, but when they're being warm, it's like just straight up, like there's a genuine warmth, and if they're not being warm, then it's a genuine like, I'm not being warm. You always know where you stand.
Now that we've seen Canadian racialized stories like Diggstown and The Porter being received with great enthusiasm on CBC Gem, how can you envision such stories being played on mainstream platforms with perhaps a big city kind of approach, say Toronto?
I feel like with that question, there's a couple of things. So first of all, I think like we're living in a time where like our industry has always been behind the US, right? And I think one of the things that we've seen over and over again is that in Canada, when you make a show, your show really doesn't, unless your show sells to the US or it ends up on Netflix, Canadians don't watch. And that's a challenging thing for broadcasters, producers, creators, because we want to make our shows for large audiences, right? I think in terms of diversity and racial diversity, I think, once again, I go back to the whole idea of we don't really, I think Diggstown was the first of its kind in terms of a show that was about a black female, that was decidedly about, her and her family who were black, who were from a very specific part of the country. And I feel like part of what we have to do as a country is we're trying to lay the foundation where Canadians in general get used to seeing other people besides white Canadians on Canadian television, right? Where that is the norm and not the exception. When we created Diggstown, the idea of Diggstown was to do a show that was really about class, right? It was really about having this woman, this black woman, who used to be a corporate lawyer, who moved in these sort of like affluent worlds, even though she was from a poor community. The idea was to have her representing people who happened to be poor and racialized, because that tends to be, like when you look at Canada, I think statistically, most people who are racialized, there's a greater number of them who are also economically challenged. And so I think what we wanted to do is actually explore class within that. And then of course, intersectionally, there's a whole issue around race. So that was really what the show was about. And I think that what got lost in the marketing of the show in the season 1 is the idea that it was about class. Instead it became, well, this is about a black female lawyer, the first in Canada, and this is what the show is. And no, that wasn't it. And frankly, I think because white Canadians were not used to what this was going to be, or they didn't know what this was going to be, they may not have accepted it. And so my hope is that as we move forward and as we start, making more shows that have, racially diverse leads, more shows with, black, Asian, Muslim, indigenous leads, that we'll start to see more of that acceptance. And so then it's not an issue.
Absolutely. Would you be able to tell us more about what's in store, what's coming up next? Right
now I'm excited because we're about to, start shooting a movie that'll shoot in Northern Ontario, with some second unit shooting happening in Nigeria. We're making a music documentary that is about the history of black music in Canada. That's for Chorus, which will air sometime early next year. I'm in the midst of developing several projects for various broadcasters, including one about the 1700s, this young black woman was hung for setting Montreal on fire, and it's a great piece of history that a lot of Canadians don't know about, and so we're developing a limited series on that called The Hanging of Angelique. So yeah, there's a lot of things coming down the pipe.
Sounds like some amazing stuff that we can look forward to.
Yeah, it's going to be good, hopefully.
It has been really wonderful chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining us at the Vibe 105 studios.
No, thank you.
And we wish you all the best for the upcoming projects and hoping to get you back in soon.
I hope so.